Hello and welcome to the Comedy Recycling Theory. Today we'd like to do a segment on an experiment that anyone can do at home. Notice that when I throw the ball up into lesser gravitational curvature, that the ball always returns back into greater gravitational curvature. Whenever we throw the ball up, lesser gravitational curvature up here, greater gravitational curvature down here closer to the surface of the Earth. Now, both the comedy recycling theory and standard theories will agree that if we would dig a hole right here in this driveway and drop the ball down, that the ball would fall and accelerate towards the center of the Earth, at least for a while, at least till we got to the core mantle boundary. Once we get to the core mantle boundary, the comedy recycling theory says that's the point where this ball has the minimum gravitational energy. That's the point where the curvature on Earth is actually maximum. That's the point that the ball will actually fall to, and that even if the ball has extra energy and can continue sailing down past that point, that the ball will eventually slow down and return back to that point of maximum gravitational curvature. That I know of, only the comedy recycling theory makes that prediction. Only the comedy recycling theory claims that that will be the case, and that that's one of those things, again, that by doing this experiment at home in the privacy of your own home or outdoors, you can test that hypothesis yourself by throwing the ball up into lesser gravitational curvature and noticing that it always returns to greater gravitational curvature. Now let's imagine we go down to the core mantle boundary and we drill that shaft from the core mantle boundary all the way down to the center. But remember, the curvature at the core mantle boundary is greater than the curvature is at the center of the Earth. The curvature is actually minimum. It's the least on planet Earth. It's the least it can possibly be because it's at the center of everything, so that it's the same as if none of Earth's mass is there, whether you would measure it with all the Earth's mass at the point from the center or whether none of the Earth's mass was there. That point would not change. The energy of the ball at that point would not change. It's the same as if you went to as far opposite the Earth's orbit around the sun that you could go, and if you would measure that point, the ball would have virtually the same gravitational energy there as it would at the center of the Earth. But remarkably, the energy that it has there is much higher by the comedy recycling theory hypothesis than it would be right here at the surface of the Earth, because at the surface of the Earth, we've already surrendered a certain amount of energy by falling to this point, but that we lose even more energy as we go towards the core mantle boundary, and that's the point where gravitational curvature is actually maximum on planet Earth. That's the point the ball will fall to, and that even if it can sail past it, that it will always return back to that point. At the present time, we do not have a way of testing that. The day may come when we can either go to a small planetoid and give that a try, or that we'll actually develop the technology to go down 2,886 kilometers straight down and then hollow out a shaft and do the test and go below that and see if the ball will actually fall up towards the greater gravitational curvature point, as the comedy recycling theory would predict, and that I know of virtually no other theory of gravity makes that prediction or has that expectation. That's something, unfortunately, we can't test that today by actually going down there and doing that, but we can do the experiment right here and we can note the results. And we always note that whenever we throw the ball into lesser gravitational curvature, the ball always returns back to greater gravitational curvature, so that we know that the ball does that in this particular instance. And the question is, will you believe the world's greatest experts on gravity that tell you this ball will go from the core mantle boundary and drop all the way to the center of the Earth, where the curvature is actually less, it's actually zero at that point? Or will you believe the experiment you've just done here on the surface of the Earth, where the ball always returns back to greater gravitational curvature? That's the question. Who will you believe? Will you believe the experiment you've just done, or the experiment that you can do? the experiment that the comedy recycling theory has just shown you, or will you believe the world's greatest experts on gravity and the answer that's in most of the science books, most of the textbooks out there, but that's based on Newtonian formulas, Newtonian expectations, and it's not really based on the curvature hypothesis, not based on understanding how curvature creates gravity, how curvature creates that, which is what the comedy recycling theory is all about. That's one of the key differences in the comedy recycling theory. And that's also one of the key differences, that when you understand how curvature creates the effect of gravity, not the other way around, that you'll understand why a black hole does not collapse into a singularity. That's part of the understanding that will follow through by paying attention to the comedy recycling theory hypothesis. And again, that's part of that experiment that you can do in your own living room, but that I know of has been noticed by virtually nobody out there. So the comedy recycling theory is trying to show you, here's an experiment you can do for probably under $1, and that's if you produce the little sign that has the maximum curvature, lesser curvature, and then you print it upside down and turn the sign upside down and turn your camera upside down and repeat the same experiment, but just change the proposed place from which the experiment is going to occur. You just imagine that we're doing the experiment at the core mantle boundary, but that we're throwing the ball, if the center of the Earth was this way and the surface of the Earth was this way, and we threw the ball from the core mantle boundary towards that direction, that the comedy recycling theory, and only the comedy recycling theory, predicts the ball would come back to the point of maximum gravitational curvature. So the question is, will you believe that? Or will you believe the textbook answer that's found in many of the textbooks out there? And you have the choice, well, make up your own mind, but notice that anytime you go against any experiment in nature that you can do at home, and you know the result of that experiment, and say, well, let's disregard that experiment and go with somebody else's idea, that's where you're more likely to get in trouble. So here's an experiment you can do that basically disproves that idea from the world's greatest experts on gravity, that the ball will continue to drop all the way to the center of the Earth. Now, will you believe it? Will you not believe it? But you can test it out at home, and you can see the results that you actually get. And I encourage every viewer out there of this experiment to do that experiment, to actually see for yourself which way it will be, which way the ball will fall, which way will it behave, and use the experiment that you've just done as the guide. Thank you, and you can read more about it at www.cr-theory.org.